Today we're looking at the 2023 Marin DSX. This could also be called the 2022 Marin DSX because it is unchanged for the last 2 seasons. This is considered a flat bar gravel bike by Marin, and I would also call it a really nice commuting bike or general purpose street and bike path bike. It is the base model in the DSX lineup. So there are 2 more models above this with rigid forks and then one above that with a suspension fork. This bike is 26 pounds, is $1,149 in Canada and $899 if you buy it down south of the border. The other models, stepping up to the DSX1, $1,149 USD or $1,449 Canadian, the DSX2, $1,289 USD or $1,649 Canadian, and the last one, the DSX FS, that one with the suspension fork, $1,599 USD or $2,049 Canadian. I'm going to go over the details and specs, some of the things that may not be obvious just from looking at that stuff on the Marin website or from other information you'll find online. So hopefully at the end of this you'll know if this bike is appropriate for you and maybe some considerations regarding sizing and suitability. So that's where we'll go next. So starting with specifications. This is a Series 2 aluminum frame and fork. One of the things that happens when you step up from this base DSX to a DSX1 or 2 is that this fork switches from aluminum to carbon. So one thing to keep in mind. Another thing, and this is common on other models from Marin, is that the first price point we are seeing a standard quick release rear axle as well as a quick release front axle. So with that compared to the DSX 1, 2 and FS, each of those models get through axles, which basically is something that is going to add a little bit of strength and stiffness to the frame. But in this sort of classification of bike, I don't think it's that big of a deal. So not a game-changing sort of a feature that should sway you too far. Our drivetrain, microSHIFT Advent. So when you see the Advent name and you don't see the X afterwards, that means we're looking at a 9-speed drivetrain. The cassette in this case is a Sunrace cassette, and its teeth range from 11 to 46 teeth. So that is probably about as small a cassette as you would want if you still want to have a really broad range of gears. So part of this DSX name in this case here, the DS is for dual sport. X, when you see that in a lot of Marin names, means it's 1 by X, 1 by drivetrain. So on this one we have a single front chainring, meaning we have no front derailleur. If you love front derailleurs, you might want to look at the Fairfax line from Marin, but especially because they're talking about this being a gravel bike, I think this is a really practical way to go. It simplifies operations. It means there's one less thing that you're going to damage if you're riding through mucky stuff, and your chain is actually going to be less likely to bounce off in bumpy terrain like gravel with a single front chainring compared to a double or triple up front. You'll notice the frame shape here. It has this sort of recess that is pressed into the seat tube here, and it also has a plug on the front here, and that is because this bike is dropper post compatible. So if you're not familiar with that, and that is also a dropper cable port, a dropper post basically means that you have a button at your handlebars that you can press and it makes your seat go up and down. And that is particularly practical if you ride in bumpy terrain. Like mountain bikes, it is becoming very much the norm on better quality mountain bikes. And we are starting to see it being accepted more and more for city riding use, because imagine if this seat is set to a height that your leg is relatively straight when you're pedaling, and if you come to a stop, that means to get your foot to the ground, you're going to be on your tiptoes, and if you're like me and you cramp easily, you'll be getting cramps in your feet trying to reach the ground. So a dropper post, as a very simple solution, you would press a button and that seat goes down. So that is what that port is for on the front of the frame, is to allow that to happen. Super functional. If you don't use it, whatever, but they are just thinking ahead. One thing to note, This is an extra large frame that we're looking at, and we're just going through this with a friend who's interested in one of the DSX models, and she is on a size small. So a size small, instead of the seat tube coming up this high, it only comes to about this sort of height, which means you only have that amount of seat post insertion, which means, and she wants to put a dropper post on there, it means it's going to be very tricky and potentially some luck involved if we're going to be able to put a dropper post in there. So just a caution, if you're into DSXs, you're thinking you want to do a dropper post, and if you're in a size small, that is something to think about. And even in sizes like medium and large, we often end up having to chop the seat post because it will basically be blocked from going too deep into the frame there. Other details, that is so that you can mount a rack quite easily on this frame, so it is set up for that. Our dropouts are built, those two holes there, that is for fenders and racks. And we even down there is another spot where you can mount fenders, as well as a threaded hole in the bottom of that little arch between the seat stays. So this thing is built, fenders and rack. We've seen these set up as light bike packing bikes even. So a pretty versatile bike. The tires on here, these are WTB Riddlers, a really nice all-purpose sort of a tire. They've got the classic poo walls on them. We're fans of the poo walls. We think that it makes the bike kind of have a little bit of a retro gravelly vibe to it. For some people, maybe not the poo walls. For us, tan walls are awesome. As I mentioned, they're a 45C tire. Sorry, I thought that they were 40s. 45C tire. And on this base DSX, I don't know if I'd feel comfortable going with a much bigger tire. Maybe a 47, but if you wanted to run fenders or anything, you're really going to be limited to these 45s. There is room on the back that you can step up a little bit more, and I think it's only really practical to consider on the DSX 1 or 2 that you can actually go to a 29 by 2.1 tire size on those. Of course, wheels on here, alloy, double walled, nothing to write home about, but there never would be on a relatively price point bike like this. As I mentioned, it's a single front chainring, narrow wide, so those teeth are varying between narrow and wide teeth. They have full tooth profiles. That's what's helping to hold the chain really well. This is a square taper crank, so you can just in the center of your frame there, you can see the square taper. That isn't going to mean a heck of a lot to people in a bike like this. If this was a mountain bike, we would maybe be talking about the cranks being a bit more susceptible to damage if it was jumped or anything. If you're jumping this bike a bunch, you're going to have bigger issues than your cranks, I think. Like arthritis, sore hands, feet, neck, all sorts of things. Getting to more functional bits, we have Tektro M275 hydraulic disc brakes. I think these are a perfectly suitable brake. They aren't the most powerful mountain bike brakes ever, but at least they are hydraulic. They're disc brakes, so for any kind of purpose you can imagine for this bike, I think they're going to work great, and we are happy with the fact that Tektro brakes are a relatively low maintenance hydraulic disc brake. A couple of water bottle mounts, down tube and seat tube wise, so you can get a couple water bottles on the bike. Internal cable routing, so we can see our rear brake line and our rear derailleur cable going into the frame, and then they come out at the bottom of the frame and remain external from there, which I wouldn't expect any different once again at this price point. The pedals on this bike, we would consider these to be test rider pedals. They're just a nylon pedal, not a particularly good bearing that's in there. They work, as our sort of shop name for them implies, they work fine for test rides, But if you ended up riding this thing and never got any sort of damp feet or anything, your traction tends to be pretty limited, and also it is a loose ball bearing in the pedal, so they tend to develop some play over time. As you can see, they start not spinning great. Give it a month's use and those might start getting play, and that would mean that every time you sort of put your bike down you can hear the thing clanging, and it just gives kind of a cheap feel to the bike. That chainring is pressed onto the cranks, so unfortunately you can't just replace a chainring if you wanted to change from the stock 38 teeth, or if it was a case of worrying about wearing it out. But to be fair, that is a steel chainring, so you're going to go a long time before that gets worn out. The chain is a KMC 9-speed. Back here, just showing the functioning part of the brake, that is a 160mm brake rotor on there. Going to the front of the bike, we have, Marin calls these mini riser handlebars. I would say their definition of mini must mean 0, because as far as I can tell, this is a flat bar. This would be one of the things that, having sold some of these to friends and friends' parents, going with a bit of a riser bar can make this a bit more of a more comfortable bike around the city especially. So depending if you're buying this, say, as a commuter, or if you're going to be kind of aggressively riding gravel, I think the flat bar will put you in a little bit more of a bent over, powerful position. But if you're in a bit more of a cruiser mood, or if that's kind of your attitude when you ride, putting on, say, a 2-inch rise, 3-inch rise handlebar will improve the comfort somewhat. As we look at that handlebar, one thing I would point out is the reach. The reach is roughly talking about that horizontal distance from seat to handlebars. On the DSXs, I find them to be somewhat compressed. So that can mean one of two things. When you're sizing this bike, you are potentially sizing up if you are used to a bit more of a stretched feel on a bike, so that you don't feel like your hands are in your lap. There is some practical consideration to the measurements that they use, and I would say they're twofold. On gravel, it means that with not being stretched out too much, your bike is, let the camera focus in, below you rather than stretched out ahead of you, and that is going to be a bit easier on your lower back, and it's also going to be a bit better if you have to maneuver. Some people ride gravel bikes or bikes like these on single track and stuff. You'll have a little bit easier time maneuvering the bike without feeling like it's a strain on the back. But conversely, yeah, if you're on smoother roads and you really want to get the power down, sizing up on the bike or going with a longer stem may leave you in a position that feels a bit more powerful and more natural. On the forks, in this case, as I mentioned, it's an aluminum fork. The models above have carbon forks with more tire clearance. Those models above also give you multiple points to mount things on the fork, which can mean being able to put anything, cages or other luggage carrying stuff on there. In this case, I would probably just consider this to be a lowrider rack mount when you have a single mount halfway down the fork, and a lowrider is a way that you can basically put a pannier type rack over your front wheel. What else can we cover? A relatively short stem. This all adds up with the short horizontal reach on the frame. Relatively short stem leaves you room to go a little bit longer if you wanted to. This distinctive gusset, now up until this year that was shared with the Gestalt X, which this frame looked almost exactly the same as well as the San Quentin, but both of those bikes are switching away from this distinctive gusset this year. So using my tea leaves and reading the future, I will guess that this is the last year of the frame having this appearance, but I might be wrong. There is your headset gusset, and I think I have covered this bike. Oh, but look at that. These slide-on grips. If you've watched a bunch of my videos, congratulations, you're a very patient person, but I'm not a huge fan of slide-on grips, and these in particular, I find them to be a combination of fat, so just kind of broad this way, but the material not particularly comfortable. So as well as pedals on this bike, for myself, depending on the uses I was going to have in mind for this bike, I would personally consider a couple things. There's a lot of ergonomic grips that will have a little bit of a flatter sort of a profile here, and that gives you a little bit of padding for the meat of your hand, which is where I'm touching my fingers there. So I would consider that. I would also even, if you're gonna go for longer rides, I would also even consider putting some bar ends on here. And what that's gonna do is just allow you to have two sort of main positions that you can put your hands in, and that'll just give you some relief to the pressure points in your hands and that little bit of changing ergonomics on a long ride again, and that'll help your hands, your shoulders, your neck, all that sort of stuff. So this is the Marin DSX. We touched a bit on sizing. I would say for a lot of people, size up a bit. That means our usual recommendations for Marins is mediums are about 5'7" to 5'10", larges about 5'10" to 6'1". I would maybe step down halfway between those sort of sizes. So just using that, I would say large, maybe even 5'8", 5'9", up to 5'11", something like that. And XL being a size like this, maybe you would start considering that at 6 feet tall and maybe up to 6'3", 6'4". These bikes can be quite useful as light bikepacking bikes, as I mentioned, commuter bikes, gravel bikes. I would kind of call them mountain bikers' gravel bikes, because mountain bikers tend not to be as romantically drawn to having drop handlebars. And one of the big things with a flat handlebar gravel bike is that you save money. Not many people realize that like on a gravel bike, a lot of the cost sort of compared to the entire bike price is the fancy lever shifter units on a drop bar style compared to just flat shifters, brake levers. So you're looking at this at $11.49 in Canada. That same sort of thing, if you're looking at similar sort of spec on a drop handlebar bike with hydraulic discs, if such a thing existed, it would be $2,000. And one thing to consider is on traditional gravel bikes, gearing like this, 9-speed with 11 to 46 speeds, or 11 to 46 teeth, is not really something that is being offered combined with a hydraulic disc brake. microSHIFT, the guys that make this drivetrain, they do drop bar, wide range sort of price point gearing, but it's not combined with hydraulic discs. So there is some practical reason why you're getting something a little bit special on this Marin DSX. So I think that is it for a very quick once over. This is a bike we really like. We have sold DSXs to friends and family, and yeah, people are happy with these things. They're super functional, they're fun. If the bike paths around your home vary between pavement, gravel, you've got some gravel roads you want to explore, this could be a great fit for you. So thanks for watching. If you've watched this far, you may as well press the like and subscribe button, because you're a patient person and you obviously love bikes. So thanks again, we'll talk to you later.